The room was ice cold, not from the air conditioning, but from what was coming. Inside a packed congressional hearing in Dallas, a place usually filled with speeches and polite nods, Vice President J.D. Vance sat still, staring straight ahead. His eyes didn't blink. His jaw was tight. Texas Governor Greg Abbott was mid-sentence, defending his administration's border policies. Then, J.D. Vance leaned into the mic, slowly, and said the words that would make history. "You let Texas down." The crowd froze. The air cracked with silence. Abbott stopped mid-word. News cameras zoomed in like hunting hawks. You could hear a pin drop. This wasn't politics. This was heartbreak. J.D.'s voice was steady, but his eyes, red-rimmed, held pain. Pain for mothers in El Paso. Pain for children in Laredo. Pain for forgotten Texans who didn't get their emergency calls answered. No one saw it coming, and no one was ready for what he said next. This wasn't about power. It was personal. And as Abbott stared at him, speechless, the world waited for the reply. But J.D. wasn't finished. J.D. Vance looked out across the hearing room, then down at the notes he never used. He didn't need them. His voice softened. "I met her in Laredo," he said. A few weeks ago, he'd visited a small border town, unannounced, no cameras, no press, just him. He'd heard about a 12-year-old girl who hadn't been seen since walking home from school. Her name was Isabel. Her mother, shaking and tired, told J.D. her story over a worn kitchen table. She spoke of open border crossings, of late-night gunshots, and of the day her daughter vanished into the dark. J.D. swallowed. "She begged me not to leave until someone listened." He looked back at Abbott. "You didn't listen, Greg." The governor stiffened, eyes darting around the room. J.D. continued. "You flew migrants to other states for headlines, but didn't show up for Isabel. You sent buses, but not help. And now, she's still missing." Someone in the audience gasped. Tears filled J.D.'s eyes, but he didn't let them fall. This wasn't just policy. It was real. And for the first time in years, Texas and America was truly listening. Governor Greg Abbott finally leaned forward. His voice cracked. "J.D., you don't understand what it's like." But J.D. Vance didn't flinch. He knew exactly what it was like. Abbott tried to explain the federal pressures, the lawsuits, the limited resources. "We're doing what we can," he said, but his words felt hollow. J.D. raised one hand. "No, don't speak to me about pressure." He stood now, his voice growing. "Do you think I don't feel pressure when a mother asks me to find her daughter, and all I can do is hold her hand and pray?" The silence returned. Then Abbott said something no one expected. "I remember Isabel too. I got her letter. I never wrote back." Gasps echoed across the room. Even the reporters stopped typing. J.D. looked stunned. For a second there was silence between them, a silence filled with everything unsaid. Then J.D. said quietly, "You still have time to do the right thing." The whole country leaned in. Millions watched this clip later, tears in their eyes, not just because of the story, but because of the raw humanity. And it was only just beginning. A day after the hearing, a video surfaced on social media. It wasn't from the news. It wasn't from any campaign. It was shot on a shaky iPhone, outside a weathered house in South Texas. A woman stood there, holding a small picture frame close to her chest. It was Isabel's mother. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "They told me my daughter's case wasn't important enough, that too many girls go missing now, that they were overwhelmed." Her hand trembled. Then through tears, she whispered, "But J.D. sat at my table. He held my hands, and he cried with me." That 46-second clip went viral in minutes. Hashtags exploded. "Justice for Isabel." J.D. was there. Meanwhile, the governor's office went silent. J.D. Vance didn't tweet. He didn't post. He just called the mother that night. No staff, no cameras. Just a quiet voice through the phone. "I haven't forgotten." Millions watching the clip cried, because for the first time, someone in power wasn't talking politics. He was talking pain. 2 days later, J.D. Vance arrived in Eagle Pass, Texas, unannounced again. The sun was setting. The Rio Grande shimmered with golden light, but beneath it, the mood was heavy. Border agents looked tired. Locals looked afraid. J.D. walked slowly through the neighborhood where a 17-year-old boy had just been found unconscious, left behind by a smuggler. The boy's sister, Maria, just 15, stood beside J.D., clutching a rosary. He wanted to be a firefighter, she whispered. Now he might never wake up. J.D.'s face hardened, not with anger, but with sorrow. He turned to a small crowd that had gathered and said something raw. Texas deserves more than press conferences and promises. It deserves protection. That line hit deep. But what happened next shocked even J.D. A retired Texas Ranger stepped forward, tears in his eyes. "We asked Abbott for help. We begged. We sent letters. Nothing came." Then he added, "But you came, son. You came." That moment broke something open. You could feel it. This was no longer about headlines. It was about heartbreak and healing. And J.D. Vance was in the middle of it. That night, back in Austin, an anonymous leak hit the press. A private email, marked confidential, had been sent from Abbott's inner circle just weeks earlier. The message? "We can't afford to respond to every border case. Focus on the optics. Prioritize appearances." The internet exploded. News outlets scrambled. The governor's team scrambled harder. But the damage was done. And J.D. Vance? He didn't say a word. Instead, he met with a group of border sheriffs behind closed doors. These weren't politicians. These were men and women who buried their own deputies, who walked into danger daily. J.D. listened, took notes, asked real questions. Then one sheriff stood, holding back tears, and said, "We've begged Washington for years. You're the first to really see us." Later, as J.D. rode back in a dusty van, he stared out the window and whispered, "We've lost our way." But he wasn't defeated. He was preparing for the biggest speech of his life, one that would shake every corner of the country, and the governor still hadn't answered the mother's call. 3 days after J.D.'s visit to Eagle Pass, a new image swept through the internet. It wasn't a headline. It wasn't a press release. It was a drawing, crayons on paper, a little house, a missing girl, and beneath it, a child's shaky handwriting. "Please find my sister. Luis, age 8. The paper was taped to the wall of a church where J.D. had quietly lit a candle for Isabel. Someone took a picture, someone shared it, and within hours, millions had seen it. Even hardened journalists cried on air. Celebrities reposted it. Parents clutched their children tighter. Vice President J.D. Vance's voice cracked during a radio interview that night. "Luis reminded me why we fight." The drawing hit people in a way policies never could. And while J.D. stayed mostly silent, quietly working behind the scenes, Governor Abbott's office released a cold, one-line response. "We are reviewing the situation." That line would haunt them. Because across America, people weren't asking, "What's happening in Texas?" They were asking, "Why isn't anyone doing something except J.D. Vance?" Governor Greg Abbott finally stepped before the press. It had been 6 days since J.D. Vance's public accusation. 6 days of silence. Pressure was mounting. Public anger was growing. The missing girl's face was now on every screen in America. He cleared his throat. "Texas is doing its part," he began, his voice stiff. "We're securing the border. We've deployed the National Guard. We've built the wall where the federal government has failed. A reporter interrupted him. "What about Isabel?" Abbott paused. Then something unexpected happened. His voice wavered. "I failed her," he said softly. The room froze. Some reporters gasped. "I received her mother's letter. I didn't reply. I didn't act. And now, we don't know where she is." He looked down at his hands. "But J.D. Vance did something I didn't. He showed up." There it was. On live television, Governor Abbott did the unthinkable. He admitted his failure. And more shocking, he didn't deflect. He didn't attack J.D. He praised him. That clip would rack up over 50 million views in 48 hours. But the real moment? It was still coming. Because J.D. wasn't done. He had one last stop to make. J.D. Vance sat alone in his Washington office that night, holding an envelope. It was old, torn at the edges, written in smudged ink, Isabel's letter. Her mother had given it to him quietly days ago. "She wrote it after her birthday," she said. "No one ever read it." J.D. opened it. Inside was a drawing of her school, a little heart, and a line that made J.D. stop breathing. "When I grow up, I want to help people who are forgotten." He pressed the letter to his chest, eyes shut. He saw himself in Isabel, poor, forgotten, surrounded by fear, wanting to be heard. And in that moment, J.D. made a decision. He would bring her story to the Senate floor, not in a press release, not in a campaign ad, but in a speech that would honor every child like Isabel and shame every leader who ever turned away. As the sun rose the next morning, J.D. Vance stood with a suitcase in one hand and Isabel's letter in the other. The storm was just beginning. The Senate chamber was crowded, yet unusually quiet. Not because of the usual rules, but because something felt different. Vice President J.D. Vance stepped up to the podium. No cue cards, no handlers, just one folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket, Isabel's letter. He began not with facts, but a story. "She would have turned 13 last week," J.D. said softly. Her name was Isabel. She had brown eyes, a nervous smile, and dreams. Senators looked up. She drew a picture of her school. She wanted to help people, but she never made it home. J.D.'s voice trembled. "I met her mother. I held her as she sobbed. And I realized something. This chamber debates policy, while real families bury hope." Gasps. J.D. reached into his coat and gently unfolded the crayon drawing. He placed it on the podium. "I'm not here to blame a party or pass a bill. I'm here because this country's soul is at stake." Then he looked straight into the cameras. "If we turn our back on Isabel, we lose more than a child. We lose who we are." The chamber stayed quiet. For the first time in years, everyone was listening. The next day, J.D. Vance was in his office, eyes tired from reading hundreds of letters pouring in from across the country. Then his aide rushed in. "Sir, you need to see this." Standing at the door was Governor Greg Abbott. No press, no reporters, no agenda. Abbott held something in his hand, a photo of Isabel, the same one that had gone viral. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. J.D. didn't speak. He simply nodded. "I failed her," Abbott whispered, "and I failed you." J.D. finally replied, his voice calm but heavy. "This was never about me." Abbott looked down. "I want to help, if you'll let me." J.D. studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Then sit down and listen." For the next hour, the two men talked behind closed doors, not as rivals, but as two leaders finally facing the weight of human lives, not polling numbers. And outside, across America, the country held its breath. Because maybe, just maybe, something was changing. And it all started with a missing child's drawing. That weekend, J.D. Vance flew back to Texas, but not for politics. He went to Isabel's school, the same one she drew in her letter. He asked for no cameras, but one teacher recorded it anyway, from the back of the auditorium. There, in front of 6th and 7th graders, J.D. stood with Isabel's photo in hand. "I came today not as vice president," he said, "but as a father and a listener." He knelt beside a small wooden chair with Isabel's name taped to the back. "She used to sit right here, didn't she?" The room nodded silently. Then J.D. looked up and said something no one forgot. "I can't bring Isabel back, but I can promise you this. Her voice will never be ignored again, not on my watch." Children cried. Teachers hugged one another. The video hit 72 million views in 4 days, and a new hashtag swept the internet. Isabel lives Ines. But J.D. knew. This wasn't the end of the story. The nation still had one more lesson to learn, and the hardest part was yet to come. The Capitol press room was buzzing. Word had leaked. Vice President J.D. Vance and Governor Greg Abbott were about to hold a joint press conference. No one could believe it. Just 2 weeks ago, Vance had accused Abbott of letting Texas down, live on national TV. And now, they were standing side by side. But when the cameras rolled, J.D. didn't speak first. Abbott did. He cleared his throat. "I've made mistakes. But when J.D. Vance challenged me, he forced me to face them. And now, together, we're going to act." J.D. stepped forward. His voice was steady. "This isn't about politics anymore. It's about people, about Isabel, about the 8-year-old who drew that picture, about every parent still waiting for answers." Then he paused. "And to those who say Greg and I are enemies, no. We're brothers now, in grief, in responsibility." The room went still. Outside, thousands gathered. Some clapped, some cried, some were confused. But something had shifted. Because 2 powerful men who once stood oceans apart were now walking side by side, toward something bigger than both of them. The rally in Houston was meant to be hopeful. J.D. and Abbott were launching a new border security initiative, paired with emergency funding for families of the missing. Thousands came. But halfway through J.D.'s speech, something happened. A man in a worn veteran's jacket stood up from the crowd, tears flooding his eyes. He was shaking. He raised a photo high in the air. "This is my daughter, Ava," he shouted. "She was taken 3 years ago. I begged your offices. I begged the governor. No one helped." The crowd went silent. Cameras turned. Staffers froze. J.D. walked straight off the stage. He climbed down, approached the man slowly, and whispered, "I see her. I see you, and I'm sorry." The man collapsed into J.D.'s arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Abbott stood behind them, face pale. J.D. turned back to the mic, still holding the man's hand. "We can't give him his daughter back, but we can make sure no father ever stands alone like this again." The crowd wept. This wasn't a rally anymore. It was a reckoning. And J.D. Vance was no longer just a vice president. He was a voice for every forgotten parent in America. 2 days later, J.D. Vance stood in the pouring rain at a Texas border checkpoint. He wasn't there for a photo op. He was delivering a box of handwritten letters from children across the country to the families of the missing. One read, "Dear Isabel's mom, I'm 11. I don't know what to say. But I cried when I saw her drawing. I wish I could hug you." Another said, "Please don't give up. I believe in you. I believe she's still in heaven watching." J.D. handed the box to a local volunteer, water dripping from his coat, and simply said, "Please make sure they know they're not alone." A journalist hiding behind an umbrella asked, "Why are you really here, Mr. Vice President?" J.D. paused. "Because I was once a child no one believed in, and now that I have power, I refuse to waste it." That quote went viral within hours, but it wasn't the words that broke people. It was the way J.D. stood in the rain, refusing to move until every letter had been delivered. He wasn't performing. He was grieving with the nation. And something in the country's heart cracked wide open. 3 weeks after J.D.'s Senate speech, after the rallies, the school visit, and the joint press conference, a phone rang inside the El Paso Police Department. It was a trucker. He'd seen a girl's face on a flyer taped to a gas station wall in Oklahoma. "I think I saw her, in the back of a trailer." Authorities scrambled. The tip was real. 12 hours later, law enforcement stormed a remote compound near Amarillo. Inside, malnourished, shaken but alive, they found Isabel. She was wrapped in a dusty pink blanket. A medic asked, "Do you know your name?" She whispered, "Isabel, where's my mom?" Across America, screens lit up with breaking news. People screamed, prayed, fell to their knees. In Washington, J.D. Vance stood alone in his office as an aide handed him the phone. Isabel's mother was crying on the other end. You didn't forget her," she wept. J.D. couldn't speak. He wiped his face, heart pounding. This wasn't just a victory. It was a miracle. But now, America would have to decide what kind of country it would be for the next Isabel. A week later, J.D. Vance stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Not to campaign, not to speak, to honor. Behind him stood Isabel, holding her mother's hand, wearing a new dress and a nervous smile. All 50 states live-streamed the moment. Cities paused. Schools dimmed their lights. It was time. J.D. took the podium, his voice barely above a whisper. "Today, we remember every child who didn't come home, every mother who waited at the window, every father who searched through tears." He looked at Isabel. She looked back at him with trust. "Let this be the last time a child feels forgotten in this nation. Let this be the last time a mother feels alone." Then he asked something rare. "I ask this nation, every household, every school, every phone, to pause for 1 minute of silence." And it happened. Airports, markets, Congress, the entire country went quiet. Not for politics, but for a little girl who survived, and for the millions who still needed hope. J.D. Vance didn't raise his voice that day. He raised a nation's soul. Later that night, J.D. Vance returned to the Texas home where he'd first met Isabel's mother. It was quiet now. She met him at the door, held his hand, and led him inside. Isabel ran into his arms. "You found me," she whispered. J.D. knelt, eyes red. "You saved yourself. I just never stopped believing you were worth finding." Outside, candlelight vigils were held in every major city. Children sang, parents held hands. And as J.D. walked back to his car, a neighborhood boy ran up and handed him a new crayon drawing. It was a picture of Isabel standing in front of a flag, smiling. J.D. looked down, then up at the stars. This wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something better. He turned to the camera, eyes full of tears, not from pain, but from hope. Dear viewers, if this story moved you, if it made you cry or reflect or simply feel, please like this video. Drop a comment for Isabel or for every child who still needs justice. And if you believe in stories that touch the heart and change the world, subscribe now. We're just getting started. Because stories like this, they don't end. They keep going. With you.